Hey, welcome back to Everyday Economics. The podcast helps you learn about the economic world happening around you every day. I'm your host, Chris Krug, president of the 501c3 nonprofit, nonpartisan Franklin News Foundation. Everyday Economics is a production of America's Talking Network. You can check out all of our great podcasts at americastalking.com. To support Everyday Economics and podcasts just like this one, please make your tax-deductible charitable contribution by clicking the link in the show description. We are recording this episode on Wednesday, May 3rd, and joining me as always, the ubiquitous sartorial splendor himself, Dr. Orphe Divounguy. He's a PhD economist. Hey, Dr. O, it's time to talk about the debt ceiling. Here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to say I'm not sure that there is such a thing as a debt ceiling. It's kind of like an idea. It's more like like our debt ceiling is kind of like the sky. Yeah, there's got to be an end to it, but I'm not sure where that end is. It just kind of keeps going until, I don't know, you see the stars or whatever. What's going on with this debate? Why does the debt ceiling matter?
But that's it, right? It's really interesting that you say that. The question is, does it actually matter?
Yes, of course it matters. But I mean, to what degree does it matter? And does it matter now? And how's it going to matter in 5 years from now?
It's this almost imaginary line because the debt ceiling doesn't seem to matter when we talk about the budget and appropriations, right? So what you have basically is, this limit on how much debt the U.S. government can incur. It dates back to 1917 during World War I and was revised during the 1930s, two periods where government spending had soared. The bottom line is they spend first, they appropriate, they go and spend, and then there's this weird line and they say, okay, now we're reaching the debt ceiling. Let's push that debt ceiling up again a little bit so we can pay our bills. It's essentially like me going out and spending on my credit card first. And I spend and I spend and I spend and I spend. And then I tell the credit card company, hey, you know what? I overspent. I don't want to pay you anymore. I think that, it's a little bit, it doesn't make any sense to have a debt ceiling, because if the debt ceiling basically is just a line in the sand, but we've already spent the money, we might as well just pay. We pay what we owe. I think that's what, America was kind of founded on, right? This idea that, we should pay our bills. And ultimately, I think we should pay our bills. And that's it. If we didn't want to go over the debt ceiling, we should have not spent or appropriated all that money in the first place, right? So the debates that are happening right now between Democrats and Republicans, about, we need to cut spending and all that stuff. Well, you should have done that prior. You should have done that during the budgeting process, not now. The money's already spent. Go and pay your bills. And that's what I got to say. But anyway, the reason we're talking about this is because it turns out to be a major issue, because if we don't raise the debt ceiling, guess who's going to suffer? I think a lot of people who are opposed to raising the debt ceiling don't realize that more than 2/3 of these U.S. marketable securities are owned by Americans. 76% of total federal government debt is in those marketable securities held by the public, mostly Americans. Foreigners, tiny little percentage of U.S. public debt. So essentially, if we don't raise the debt ceiling and the government shuts down, well, guess what? And, who's going to lose out? It's Americans who lose out, right? And it comes in the form of a massive income shock. Like those pension plans or those retirees that are waiting for their payments are not going to get them. And they can't afford not to get them. So the first victim in all of this is American residents, American citizens, people who live here, who own these securities, right? Who own U.S. debt. That's the first group that suffers directly. And then you have the economic consequences of not just the default itself, but also the threat of default. In 2011, the mere threat of default caused stock prices to plunge, which again hurts American consumers and businesses, led to higher market volatility, and interest rates increased, right? So now you get a push in borrowing cost, an increase in borrowing cost, and America's credit rating was downgraded for the first time. Those are the consequences of the mere threat of default, right? And so I would absolutely urge Congress to act immediately on the debt ceiling. If you want to talk about the budgeting process, if you want to talk about reducing spending, if you want to talk about all those things, I think you should do it during that process.
Oh my gosh, yes.
You should do it knowing that you do have a debt ceiling. If you want to keep that debt ceiling, then at least make sure that when you're having that conversation about spending, you keep in mind that debt ceiling. Otherwise get rid of the debt ceiling because it's pointless. Okay. Lastly, look, talk about serious consequences. Financial institutions borrow to meet their obligations by using treasury securities as collateral, right? You saw what happened to SVB, right? You saw what happened to
the Silicon Valley Bank,
right? You have these treasuries as collateral, right? And so a U.S. default would make those treasuries completely worthless, which would reduce banks' ability to borrow, to make cash available to depositors, right? Which are basically you and I, households and businesses, which would cause widespread panic and potential bank runs and likely another financial crisis. We just don't want to go there.
I agree with you, right? And it's not in my best interest to argue economics with the economist. But let me just throw this back at you. If I can, I feel like I'm playing tennis with the tennis machine today. You're running me from both sides of the baseline. You're the pro. Do we not need to go through some suffering in this country economically to fix our economy from the standpoint of accountability? I mean, I feel like we do. I mean, no limit spending, and we're just going to keep going back and asking people for more and more and more. I mean, it's like, gee whiz, man. I mean, how does that work forever? I mean, because that's the trajectory that we're on, is that this is a policy that is shared in Washington by both sides of the aisle without regard for a future.
That conversation needs to be had during that process, right? When they're appropriating, when they're funding different programs, that's when the conversation needs to happen. Not now.
The sorting out of this in the postmortem, I'm sorry. I mean, this is I think where a lot of Americans just kind of look at it and go, what in the world is going on here? How did this happen?
Yeah, look, this is not the time for that conversation. I think, and sadly, people in Congress are trying to have that conversation now. And this is not the time for that conversation. And this is not a support of either party. I'm talking purely from an economics perspective and from what makes the most sense. What makes the most sense here is to protect the lives and livelihoods of Americans. This would be an absolute disaster. Pension and retirement plans are some of America's biggest bond buyers, with roughly 15%.
I think people understand that. And I think that the people that we try to communicate with through everyday economics, I mean, I think they understand that. But when is there a good time to talk about harsh realities? I mean, in theory, you should be talking about them in good times, not in bad times. I get it. We're kind of up against the wall here as a country with regard to our current situation.
When we had the conversation about the stimulus, it was a question of, and by the way, both parties embraced, whether it was the Trump stimulus packages or the Biden stimulus, both parties embraced them. Okay.
But you and I agreed, and I think that we're right. Too much to too many for too long.
I think that's it. I think there was widespread stimulus to households that had not even lost their jobs during the pandemic. And I wrote about that. And I think, that was a problem. And the question was, whether we were going to pay for it in higher taxes or we were going to pay for it with higher inflation. And we're paying. Inflation soared to 9%, above 9% mid of 2022, the highest in 40 years. And again, I wrote about this back then. The question was, are we going to have to pay for this with higher income taxes or with higher inflation? If we did, there's no free lunch. And that's the lesson to be learned here. And we did. And so, but again, not to distract from this conversation, I think the debt ceiling issue needs to be resolved immediately. It's time for Congress to do its job to raise the debt limit so that the bills get paid. Because if the bills don't get paid, everyone suffers.
For Dr. Divounguy, this has been Chris Krug. Subscribe to Everyday Economics and dozens of other quality podcasts at americastalking.com.